You've been studying wrong your whole life. Not a little wrong, fundamentally, structurally, at the core wrong. And the worst part, the thing you were told to do instead, the learning styles, framework that teachers have been pushing for decades, was invented by a high school teacher, not a scientist, and even he admits it doesn't work the way people think. This video is about how memory actually works. We're going to tear apart the myths you were handed in school, then replace them with the techniques that cognitive scientists have spent 50 years quietly proving actually works. Some of these will feel wrong, that's the point. By the end, you'll understand why the most effective study methods feel completely useless while you're doing them, and why that feeling is exactly the signal that your brain is learning. Here's what we're covering. First, why learning styles are not just ineffective, but potentially harmful. Then, the counterintuitive science of how memory actually forms. And finally, the specific techniques that outperform everything else, backed by the numbers that are genuinely hard to believe. Let's start with something that's going to upset a lot of people. You've probably taken a learning style quiz at some point: visual, auditory, reading, kinesthetic, VARK. Maybe you identified as a visual learner and started making color-coded notes everywhere. Maybe you were told you were kinesthetic and suddenly had an explanation for why school felt so hard. It feels true, it feels personal. It feels like finally someone understands how your brain works. But here's the thing. Neil Fleming, the man who created VARK, was a New Zealand high school teacher, not a neuroscientist, not a cognitive psychologist, a teacher who built a classroom conversation tool, and then watched it escape into the world and became educational gospel. Researchers have now cataloged more than 70 different classification systems for learning styles, 70, and none of them agree with each other. The disagreement is itself the evidence. If these models were measuring something real in the brain, they'd converge. They don't, because they are not measuring anything real. But it gets worse. A study gave students the VARK questionnaire, told them their learning style, and then watched what happened next. Nearly 70% of those students immediately went back to studying the exact same way they always had. They didn't change a thing. Even the believers don't actually use it, which tells you something important. Deep down, people already sense it doesn't quite fit. And here's where it stops being just ineffective and starts being actually damaging. When a student is told you're a visual learner, something shifts. They start avoiding reading heavy subjects, they tune out lectures, they build an identity around a limitation that was never real. A review from the Swansea University put it plainly. This isn't just a neural myth. It actively harms learners by narrowing how they engage with material in ways that have real academic consequences. You were handed a story about yourself, and that story quietly closed doors. So, if learning styles don't work, what does? This is where the science gets genuinely strange, because the answer is the things that feel like they are not working. Robert Bjork at UCLA spent decades studying what he called desirable difficulties. The core idea is this: your brain doesn't strengthen memories when the things feel easy. It strengthens them when things are hard. Easy is the enemy of retention. Struggle is the mechanism. Here's the experiment that proved it. In 1978, a psychologist gave college students a simple memory task. Half the group read words paired like rapid, fast, clean, clear, easy. The other half saw rapid, F, and had to fill in the blank themselves. The second group struggled. They were slower, they made errors, it felt unproductive. 1 week later, on a surprise memory test, the group that struggled remembered dramatically more. The researcher who ran the study was baffled by his own results. The difficulty wasn't a bug, the difficulty was the feature. This principle has a name: the generation effect, and it's been replicated consistently since 1978. When your brain produces information, when it has to reach for something and construct it, That information is encoded 20 to 40% better than the information you simply read. Rewriting your notes in your own words isn't just good advice. It's neurologically different than copying them. The act of generation creates a different kind of memory trace. But if you don't understand why spacing matters, you're still leaving most of the gains on the table. Here's what cramming actually does to your brain. When you sit down and study the same material for 6 hours straight, your brain stops working very quickly. It recognizes the pattern, it stops reconstructing. You feel like you're learning because the information feels familiar. But familiarity and memory are not the same thing. Familiarity is shallow, memory is structural. Now, here's the counterintuitive part. Forgetting is not the enemy of learning. Forgetting is actually a required step in the process. When you space out your study sessions, when you let some time pass between them, a small amount of forgetting happens, and when you come back and try to retrieve the information, your brain has to reconstruct the memory. That reconstruction process is what strengthens the neural pathway. You're not just accessing the memory, you're rebuilding it, and each rebuild makes it sturdier. Cramming prevents that forgetting, which means it prevents the reconstruction, which is why everything you crammed for an exam evaporates within 48 hours. The research on space practice is some of the most consistent in all cognitive science. It's not controversial, it's not a fringe idea, it just never made it into how schools actually teach, probably because it's harder to schedule and harder to feel. But there's the one that really messes with people's heads. Testing yourself before you've learned the material, even when you get every single answer wrong, makes you learn it better afterward. This is called the pre-testing effect, and it sounds insane. Why would getting everything wrong help you? Here's why. When you attempt a question and fail, your brain doesn't just move on. It creates a gap, a slot, a specific kind of cognitive hunger for the correct answer. When you then encounter the right information, it snaps into that slot with a force it wouldn't have had otherwise. The wrong answer primed the brain to receive the right one. Rosner and colleagues demonstrated in 2015 that students who generated exam questions before reviewing material consistently outperformed students who simply reviewed material. You don't need to know the answer, you just need to attempt it. That's important, but there's one more technique that produces numbers so good they almost don't seem real. It's called interval practice, and it feels catastrophically unproductive while you're doing it. Most students study in blocks, chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3, all algebra, then all geometry, then all statistics. It feels organized, it feels efficient, it feels like you're building mastery one layer at a time. But what your brain is actually doing is recognizing the pattern and coasting. Every problem looks like the last one. You're not really thinking, you're executing. Interval practice does the opposite. You mix subjects, topics, and problem types. Within a single session, you might do 3 algebra problems, then 2 geometry problems, then back to algebra, then statistics. It feels chaotic. It feels like you're not getting anywhere. Students who tried consistently report feeling like they're learning less than when they block practice. They are wrong. One study tracked students through a 30-day delay after either block or interval practice. The interval group retained 80% of what they learned. After a month, the blocked group dropped significantly. But here's the number that's hard to process. The interval group's score only dropped from 8% to 78% across the entire month. Near immunity against forgetting. The reason is exactly what you'd expect once you understand desirable difficulties. When you mix problem types, your brain can't coast. It has to identify which approach applies before it can even begin solving. That identification process, that extra cognitive step, is what real exams demand. You are not just practicing the material, you're practicing judgment. Now, not every idea in learning science survives scrutiny, and it's worth knowing which ones don't. You've probably heard that you should study in the same environment where you'll be tested. Study at a desk if you'll take the exam at a desk. It's in virtually every psychology textbook, based on a classic 1975 experiment where divers who learned word list underwater remembered them better underwater than on land. It's a clean, elegant result. It became gospel. In 2021, researchers tried to replace it. They ran the same experiment with the same conditions. The effect disappeared. The divers remembered equally well regardless of the environment. That's not a small caveat. That's the foundation of advice crumbling. Context-dependent memory may exist in extreme conditions, but the practical implication that you should obsessively match your study environment to your test environment, that evidence doesn't hold. And then there's sans forgetica, a term at MIT University actually designed a font, a hard-to-read, slightly distorted font, specifically engineered to force your brain to work harder while reading, triggering deeper encoding. The idea was rooted in the disfluency effect, which is real and documented. The font became a minor scientific celebrity. People downloaded it. Teachers experimented with it. Then, subsequent research looked more carefully and found the benefits didn't hold up at scale. It's a beautiful idea. It just doesn't quite survive contact with rigorous testing, which is itself a useful lesson. A mechanism being real doesn't mean every application of it works. So here's where we land. Learning styles, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, all of it, are not grounded in science. They were built on a classroom conversation tool. They never been validated by research. More than 70 competing systems exist and none agree. And when students are told their style, most don't even use it. Worse, believing in them can narrow how you engage with learning in ways that genuinely cost you. What actually works is almost the opposite of what it feels productive. Generate information instead of receiving it. Your brain encodes what it produces 20 to 40% better than what it reads. Space out your sessions and let yourself forget a title. Because forgetting is the mechanism that makes retrieval strengthen the memory. Taste yourself before you feel ready. Even getting everything wrong primes your brain to absorb the right answers more deeply. Mix up your subjects mid-session because the chaos forces the judgment that exams actually test. None of these feel like learning, they all feel like struggling. And that's exactly the point. VARK desirable difficulties framework is really just one idea restated in 4 different ways. Your brain gets stronger at the things it has to work for. The students who understand these don't just study harder, they study in a way that compounds. Every session builds on the last. Every retrieval strengthens the pathway. Every wrong answer on the pretest is a slot that the right answer will fill permanently. You came in thinking you had a learning style. You're leaving knowing you have a brain, and that brain responds to specific conditions that have nothing to do whether you prefer diagrams or lectures. If these change how you think about studying, drop a comment below. I want to know which of these you're going to actually try first: pre-testing, interleaving, or spacing, because the people who comment are always the one who actually follow through. And if you know someone who still swears by their learning style, send them this. They deserve to know.